Martin cried over Uncle Thomas's coffin like no ordinary friend would cry, and I only realized this 3 days later, when I felt his tool right between my legs. At the funeral, he held on to the edge of the coffin with his white fingers and whispered something to himself. He was tall, thin, with graying temples and a face that looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I thought he was my uncle's colleague or a distant relative, just tired from grief and formalities. After the funeral, he came up to me and held out his trembling hand. He introduced himself as Martin, said he was a friend of Thomas's and would help with the inheritance paperwork, that he was a notary. His voice was quiet, his eyes red. He avoided looking me in the eye. I thanked him and said I would accept his help. He nodded and quickly walked away to his car. The next day, I arrived at my uncle's house. It was an old brick house with an overgrown garden and an apple tree by the porch. It smelled of autumn and mustiness. Martin arrived 10 minutes later with the documents and coffee. We went inside in silence. The house greeted us with dust and silence. Bookshelves up to the ceiling, old armchairs, photographs on the walls. Martin froze in the middle of the living room, looking around with such pain that I felt uncomfortable. We went into the kitchen. He laid out the papers, explained the will and documents professionally, but his gaze kept wandering to the details, to the cup on the windowsill, to the calendar with the dates circled in red. I asked what the date was. He said they had planned to go to the mountains. Thomas loved the mountains. I didn't understand then why he said they. After a couple of hours of work, Martin asked to go into the garden. I looked out the window and saw him standing under an apple tree, hugging himself and crying. I decided not to interfere with someone else's grief. I went up to the second floor and looked around the rooms. In my uncle's bedroom, there was a photo on the nightstand, Thomas hugging Martin around the shoulders with the mountains in the background. Both of them were happy and tanned. My uncle was looking at him, not at the camera. Strange, I thought. Why was this photo by the bed? In the study, there was an open notebook on the table. My uncle's last entry. He wrote about someone named M, who advised him to tell me something important, but my uncle was afraid of my reaction. The entry ended mid-sentence. M is Martin, I realized. But why did my uncle consult a notary about family matters? I began to examine the study more closely. On the bottom shelf behind encyclopedias, I noticed the edges of some notebooks. I pulled one out. There was a date on the cover. I opened at random. My uncle wrote about M, how he had said he loved him for the first time in 3 years, how happy my uncle was and how scared at the same time, how they were like teenagers. But when M was around, nothing else mattered. My breath caught in my throat. I kept turning the pages, entry after entry. His mother called and asked why he wasn't getting married. He lied about work. He wrote that if she knew that his life had begun 3 years ago when he met M. My uncle was gay, 15 years with a man, and no one in the family knew. I pulled out all the notebooks, 23 of them. I took them down to the living room, spread them out on the sofa, and started reading from the first one. They met at university. Martin came to fill out some paperwork. They started talking easily and naturally. At 43, my uncle felt like a schoolboy in love. For 6 months, they danced around the issue, afraid. Then they confessed and decided to be together. 15 years in secret. Martin would come at night and leave before dawn. They never appeared together in town. They traveled to other places where they could hold hands. My uncle wrote about happiness, how Martin made breakfast, how they read in the evenings, touching shoulders, how they made plans, and about fear, how he lied to his family, how ashamed he was to pretend. In one entry, I found something about myself. My uncle watched me grow up, wanted to be closer, but was afraid. He thought I would understand because he himself was not like everyone else in the family. He guessed about me. The last notebooks were the hardest of all. A year ago, my uncle fell ill. His heart. The doctor suggested surgery, with a 50-50 chance of success. He refused, deciding to live as long as he had the strength. Martin begged him to agree. They argued, they made up. My uncle didn't want to die on the operating table. He wanted to go home with his loved ones by his side. But in the end, Martin couldn't be there. When things got bad, they called an ambulance and the family arrived. Martin stood in the yard, off to the side. No one knew who he was. The last entry was 3 days before his death. Martin said he would come out and tell everyone the truth, that he had the right to be there publicly. My uncle forbade it. Even as he was dying, he was afraid of scandal. They both cried, then lay together, and Martin said he loved him and always would. My uncle wrote that he didn't deserve him. He asked me to forgive him for lying, for not being able to be honest. He asked me to be kind to Martin if I ever met him. He said Martin deserved happiness. And he asked me not to tell anyone, to let the family remember him as a convenient bachelor. I closed the notebook. It was 3 a.m. I had spent the whole evening reading someone else's secret life, and I felt like shit. The whole family didn't know my uncle. They saw the professor, the bachelor. They didn't see the man who loved, suffered, hid, and feared. They didn't see his happiness. And Martin lost her husband. Yes, in the notes, my uncle called her husband. They exchanged rings under an apple tree, 15 years together. And even at the funeral, Martin couldn't show who he was. He stood aside, silent, hiding as always. In the morning, I woke up to a knock. Martin was there with a bag of pastries and coffee. He looked even worse. I let him in, and we sat down in the kitchen. He talked about the documents, and I listened half-heartedly, looking at his hands. There was a silver ring on his ring finger. It was worn, old. I asked him directly if he was married. Martin turned pale and said no. It was a gift from Thomas many years ago. I said they had been close. Not a question, a statement. Martin looked at me for a long time, then quietly replied that they were friends, very close friends. He was a poor liar. His voice trembled. His eyes reddened. I nodded and didn't press the issue. I said I could see how hard it was for him to be here, and that I appreciated his help. Martin breathed a sigh of relief and went out into the garden, saying he needed some fresh air. I went up to my study, took out my notebooks, and found the entry about the apple tree. My uncle had proposed to Martin there, given him a ring, and said he wanted to be together for the rest of his life. Martin cried and put on the ring. For my uncle, he was his husband, even without a piece of paper. I went out into the garden. Martin was standing under the apple tree, crying. He heard footsteps, turned around, and didn't even try to hide his tears. He apologized, saying he couldn't stop coming here, that this place meant a lot to him and Thomas. To us, he said. I said I knew. Martin froze, not understanding. I explained that I had found the diaries yesterday and read them all night. I knew about them, and my uncle, his face turned white. He grabbed the trunk of the apple tree, covered his face with his hands, and cried. Quietly, choked up. I stood there, not knowing what to do. Martin said through his tears that Thomas had asked him to keep it a secret even after his death, afraid that the family would turn away from his memory. I replied that my uncle had left his diaries, knowing that I would be sorting through the house. Maybe he wanted me to find out. In his last entry, he asked for forgiveness and asked me to be kind to Martin. Martin asked what I thought of my uncle now, of them. I said that my uncle had a hard life, that he lived in fear, that he was a coward, as he himself wrote. But at the same time, he loved Martin so much, you can see it in every line. Martin cried again. He said he knew his uncle was a coward, that he could have left with him and started over somewhere far away. Martin had suggested it many times. But his uncle was afraid to leave his job, his house, his city. He was afraid of the scandal, of his family's reaction. Martin was angry, but he still loved him. And then his uncle got sick, refused surgery, and wanted to live out the rest of his life at home. They knew there was little time left and tried to make up for everything. Martin was there until the very end, until the ambulance was called and the family arrived. Then he had to leave, stand in the yard, and listen to the voices inside. He couldn't be there in the last hours because he was a nobody, just an acquaintance. He sat down on the grass, hugged his knees, and buried his face in his hands. I sat down next to him. I told him he wasn't nobody. He had been my uncle's husband for over 15 years. He had the right to be there. Martin looked at me. He asked if I was judging him. I answered honestly. The family would have judged him. His mother wouldn't have understood. No one would have understood. My uncle knew that, which is why he hid it. But I don't judge him. I'm sorry they couldn't live openly. I feel sorry for my uncle, who died without deciding to be honest. And I feel sorry for Martin, who lost the love of his life and can't even grieve properly. Martin cried again, no longer hiding it. We sat under the apple tree for a long time, then went back into the house. He washed up, and we continued sorting through the documents. We were silent, but the atmosphere had changed. I knew the truth, and he knew that I knew. It was reassuring. Martin came every day for the next few days to help sort through the house. We didn't talk much, but his presence was comforting. Sometimes I caught him looking at my uncle's things, a mug, a book, a blanket. I saw him freeze, touch them, as if greeting a ghost. Once I found him in my uncle's bedroom. He was standing by the window with Thomas's shirt in his hands, pressing it to his face, inhaling. I quietly left. On the fourth day, we were cleaning out the attic. I went downstairs to get some water, came back, and saw Martin on the floor with a worn copy of Brodsky's book in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks. I sat down next to him and asked what was wrong. He said that Thomas had given it to him on their first anniversary and read the poems aloud. He thought the book was lost. On the flyleaf was my uncle's inscription, M. You are my only true love. Martin pressed the book to his chest and asked if he could take it. I said, take it, it's yours. We went downstairs and drank tea. I asked him to tell me about his uncle, not from his diaries, but from his memories. Martin was surprised, but he began. He told me how they met, how Thomas was clumsy at flirting, how they danced around each other for 6 months, how their first kiss happened in this kitchen. When Martin came with the documents, Thomas poured wine, and the silence became so thick that something had to be done. He talked about their habits, how Thomas made terrible coffee, but Martin drank it every morning, seeing the care in it, how they read together by the fireplace, their shoulders touching, how Thomas snored, and Martin nudged him with his elbow, how they argued about math, philosophy, and whether beans were necessary in borscht, about trips to the mountains, to the sea, that they could be themselves, holding hands, kissing, walking arm in arm. Thomas loved hiking, even though he got tired and grumbled, but he loved the freedom of being away from everyone, alone with Martin and nature. They talked about plans to buy a house somewhere in Europe, by the sea, to live openly. Thomas said that they would definitely do this when they retired, but he didn't live to see it. Martin's voice trembled. He said that his uncle was afraid until the very end, that Martin would be left alone, would not find anyone, would suffer. Martin replied that he didn't want anyone but him, that if his uncle left, he would just go on living as best he could. But his uncle blamed himself, saying that he had taken away the years that Martin could have spent with someone who wasn't afraid to show him to the world. Martin looked at me. He said he didn't regret a single day with Thomas, not a single second, even when they were hiding, even when they were afraid. Thomas was everything to him. I said that my uncle knew that he wrote in his diaries that he didn't deserve Martin, that Martin was the best thing in his life. Martin closed his eyes, tears rolling down his cheeks. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. He covered my hand with his and squeezed it. We stood there in silence, and I could feel his shoulders shaking. In the evening, Martin left. I walked him to his car. He thanked me for listening and not judging him, said that Thomas would have been happy. I returned to the house, which seemed empty without Martin. Strangely, over the past few days, I had grown accustomed to his presence, to the way he moved around the rooms, how quietly he spoke, how he looked at my uncle's things with longing. I sat down in my uncle's chair and reread his diaries. One entry particularly caught my attention. My uncle wrote that Martin was the only one who saw the real him, without masks, fear, or lies. With him, he could be weak, tired, sad. He could cry, laugh, get angry. He could just be. And Martin accepted and loved him that way. I closed the notebook and walked over to the window. I looked at the garden, at the apple tree in the moonlight. I imagined how they stood there, how my uncle proposed, how they kissed, happy, free, at least in this secluded place. And it hit me, a sudden, furious anger, at the society that forced them to hide, at the family that didn't want to see, at everyone who thinks that love should look a certain way, and anything else is sin and shame, at my uncle, for his cowardice, for not being able to be honest even before his death, for leaving Martin without the right to grieve, but most of all at myself, for hiding too, for living the same way as my uncle, for hiding who I am from my family, for pretending, lying, avoiding questions about my personal life. I am just as cowardly. Maybe that's why my uncle wanted me to know, to warn me, don't repeat his mistakes. Don't waste your life in fear. I went to bed but couldn't sleep. I thought about Martin. Was he home alone crying? How would he live on, having lost the center of his universe? In the morning, Martin called, his voice tense. He said we needed to meet urgently, that there was something important. He arrived an hour later with an envelope in his hands. He said that Thomas had left it for him and asked him to open it after his death. He opened it yesterday, read it, and realized that I needed to see it. I pulled out the letter. My uncle's last letter. Thomas wrote to Martin, asking for forgiveness for leaving him. He asked him to move on with his life, to breathe, to love again if he met someone who would make him happy. He released him from his promise of fidelity. He said that Martin deserved love that did not hide, someone who would hold his hand in public and not be afraid to call him their own. He wrote that he'd been a coward all his life, afraid of the truth, afraid of condemnation, afraid to be himself. Martin had endured this and loved him anyway, but he deserved better. If Daniel found the diaries, and he hoped he would, Martin had to be honest, tell him everything. Daniel would understand. He had a good heart. And another thing, Daniel is very similar to Thomas, both outwardly and inwardly. Sometimes my uncle would look at me and see himself at my age, lost, searching, afraid to show the world who he was. If my uncle is right, if I am the same, Martin must help support and not let me repeat his mistakes. My uncle wrote that he loved Martin every day for 15 years and would love him wherever he went. He asked me to be happy for his sake. I finished reading, my hands shaking. I looked at Martin. He looked back at me with a question in his eyes. I said hoarsely that my uncle knew about me. Martin nodded and asked directly if it was true. I was silent, clutching the letter, then squeezed out, "Yes, I'm gay and I'm hiding too, like my uncle. My family doesn't know, no one knows." Martin sat down next to me on the sofa. We sat in silence. He said quietly that Thomas would want me not to repeat his mistakes, not to waste my life in fear. I smiled bitterly. Easy to say, hard to do. Martin agreed that he knew better than anyone else. But he said that life is too short. Thomas realized this before he died. And I still have time to change everything. I asked if he himself would continue to hide. Martin smiled sadly. He said he had lived in the shadows for 15 years and was used to it. But I could live differently. We sat there a while longer. Then he left for work. At the door, he turned around and said that if I needed to talk about anything, he was there for me. I went back to the living room and reread the letter, especially the last lines, "Be happy for my sake." Over the next few days, Martin and I continued to sort through the house, but a new closeness had developed between us. We could sit in silence for hours, working side by side, and it felt comfortable. We could talk about my uncle, about life, about fears, about hopes. Martin told stories. I listened, imagining my uncle alive. Sometimes Martin would freeze in the middle of a sentence and look at me strangely. I would ask what was wrong. He would shake his head and say that sometimes I would make a gesture or speak with Thomas's intonation, and it would overwhelm him. I began to notice it myself. I saw my uncle's features in the mirror, the shape of his eyes, the shape of his lips, his smile. It was like a young copy of him. It was strange and a little scary. On the 7th day, we were looking through photo albums on the living room floor. Martin showed me the pictures and told me where they were taken. Their first trip to the mountain. Thomas is cooking over a campfire and laughing. Both of them are wet from rain, hugging each other. Martin is sleeping on the grass. Thomas is sitting next to him and looking at him with a tenderness that made me feel sad. I noticed that my uncle was constantly taking pictures of Martin. Martin smiled and said that Thomas wanted to remember every moment, afraid of forgetting. He turned the page and froze. The photo shows Thomas and Martin kissing against the backdrop of the sunset. Silhouettes, soft light, a beautiful intimate scene. Martin ran his fingers over the photo and said that a random tourist had taken it. They were far from the city and weren't afraid of anyone. The tourist offered to take a photo, and they agreed. Thomas later ordered a large print, hung it in his bedroom, and only took it down when he fell ill so that the doctors wouldn't see it. He took out the photo and asked if he could take it with him. I said, of course. Martin hid it in his pocket and pressed his palm to his chest. By evening, they were tired. They sat on the floor among the albums, silent. Martin suddenly confessed that he didn't want to leave. This house was all that remained of Thomas. When I sell it, he doesn't know what will happen. His voice broke. I looked at him and saw pain and despair. I realized that I couldn't sell the house, couldn't erase the last thing that connected Martin to Thomas. I said I wouldn't sell it. I would keep it, maybe come here to work, but I wouldn't sell it. Martin stared at me and said I didn't have to. I replied that I knew, but I wanted to. This house is part of their history, You can't just erase that. Martin looked at me, tears glistening in his eyes. He whispered, "Thank you." We sat in silence. Then he got up and said it was time to go. I walked him to the door. On the threshold, he suddenly hugged me tightly, desperately. I froze, then hugged him back, feeling him tremble, holding back his sobs. He whispered in my ear that Thomas was right, that I had a good heart. He pulled away, quickly wiped his eyes, and walked to his car without looking back. I closed the door and leaned against it. My heart was pounding. The hug was strange, warm, necessary. I realized that I was missing this simple human warmth, touch, closeness. I had been alone for 2 years. After my last relationship ended badly, I closed myself off, threw myself into work, and avoided meeting new people. I said I wasn't ready. But after Martin's hug, I realized how much I had missed being touched. I pushed the thought away, went to the kitchen, poured my uncle some whiskey, drank slowly, and stared into the darkness outside the window. I thought about Martin, how he must feel alone without the person he had lived with for 15 years. He went up to his uncle's bedroom, lay down on his bed, and stared at the ceiling. On the nightstand was a photograph of Thomas and Martin in the mountains. He picked up the frame and looked at it. They looked so happy, so simply in love with each other. I want that, he suddenly realized. I want to love and be loved, not hide, live openly. But it's scary, damn scary. I fell asleep with these thoughts. I woke up to a thunderstorm. Rain was falling on the roof. The wind was rattling the shutters. The sky was dark. I went down to the kitchen, made coffee, and looked at the garden. The apple tree was bending in the wind. Martin called. He said that his power had been cut off because of the thunderstorm. He was sitting in the dark, and he felt lonely. He apologized for calling, knowing it was silly. I told him to come over, that there was light and a fireplace here, and he could wait out the storm. He fell silent, then asked if I was sure. I said I was sure. He arrived 20 minutes later, wet and disheveled. I gave him a towel and my uncle's dry shirt. He changed and went outside. The shirt fit perfectly, and I realized that he had worn Thomas's clothes many times before. It was familiar to him. We sat in the living room and drank tea. I lit the fireplace, and the fire crackled. Outside the window was a storm, but inside it was warm and cozy. Martin thanked me and said he couldn't be alone today. Thunderstorms were Thomas's favorite weather. He said that during a thunderstorm, the world seemed alive. We were silent, listening to the rain. Martin suddenly asked if I had someone, a love, a relationship. I shook my head. It had been a long time. It hadn't worked out. He asked why. I shrugged and said that he wanted me to be open, to introduce him to my family and friends. But I couldn't. I was afraid. We argued. He got tired waiting and he left. I don't blame him. Martin sighed. He said that he and Thomas had also argued about this. He asked to leave, to start over. Thomas couldn't. He was attached to the place, his job, his familiar life. He was afraid of losing everything. In the end, they both lost time that they could have spent differently. He looked at me and told me not to repeat my uncle's mistakes, not to waste my life on fear. I replied, "That's easy to say." He agreed, I know, but I said it anyway. We fell silent. The fire crackled. The storm grew stronger. I said, "Stay the night. The storm won't end soon. It's not worth driving." Martin hesitated, not wanting to impose. I replied that he wasn't imposing. There was a guest room, and I didn't want to be alone tonight either. He nodded and agreed. We sat for another hour, talking. Work, life, plans. Gradually, the conversation became personal. Martin talked about his family. His parents had died. He hardly spoke to his sister. About his loneliness before Thomas, how meeting him had changed everything. I talk about my family, who love me but don't know the real me. About my job, which I use as a cover from questions. About my fear of being rejected. Martin said that Thomas was afraid of the same thing. But the saddest thing is that in the end, no one knew him. He died, and everyone thinks he lived as a lonely bachelor. No one knows what he was like, how happy he was, how he loved. No one knows that he was someone's husband. His voice trembled. I looked at the ring on his finger. Martin followed my gaze and twirled the ring. He said he never takes it off and never will. He doesn't care what people think. Let them think he's a widower. That's what he is, in essence. We sat until late at night. I opened a bottle of wine, and we drank. The conversation became more candid. Martin talked about how hard it was to go on living after the loss. How every morning you wake up, forget for a second that he's gone, then remember, and it's like a punch in the chest. How everything reminds you, smells, sounds, little things. He told me how he goes into the store and automatically picks up Thomas's favorite cheese, or turns on a radio to a station, or wakes up at night and reaches for a side of the bed, but it's empty. He finished his wine, apologized, and said that I probably didn't need to hear this. I replied that I did, that it helped me understand, and that it would make it easier for him. Martin looked at me for a long time, with so much pain that I wanted to hug him, but I didn't dare. We went to our rooms late. I showed him the guest room and gave him some clean clothes. He thanked me, wished me good night, and closed the door. I lay down but couldn't sleep. I listened to Thunderstorm and thought about Martin in the next room, how lonely he must be, how scary it must be to lose someone after so many years and be left all alone. At 3 a.m, I heard sounds coming from the guest room, quiet, muffled sounds. Martin was crying. I got up without thinking, walked down the hall, and knocked softly. I asked if I could come in. He said yes. I opened the door. Martin was sitting on the bed, hugging a pillow, his face wet with tears. He didn't even try to hide. He apologized, saying he had woken me up. I replied that I hadn't been asleep. I walked into the room and sat down on the edge of the bed next to him. I asked what had happened. Martin shook his head. He was just overwhelmed. The storm, the house, this room. He and Thomas stayed here when he spent the night. Thomas didn't want Martin to sleep in his bedroom in case someone dropped in unexpectedly. Always cautious, always fearful. He clutched the pillow and said he missed Thomas so much. He wanted to hear his voice, see his smile, feel him close. He wanted him to hug him and say that everything would be okay. But he wasn't there and never would be. His voice broke into sobs. He buried his face in the pillow, his shoulders shaking. I couldn't take it anymore. I hugged him, pulled him close, stroked his back, his hair. He clung to my shirt, cried into my shoulder, and I just held him, silently. We sat like that for a long time. The sobbing subsided. His breathing evened out. He didn't pull away. I didn't let go. We just sat there hugging in the semi-darkness to the sound of the thunderstorm. He whispered, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome." He lifted his head and looked at me. Our faces were close. I could see every wrinkle, every eyelash, the glistening tears. He said quietly that I looked so much like Thomas that sometimes he looked at me and forgot it wasn't him. His hand rose, touched my face, ran along my cheekbone, and froze. He added, "But you're not him. You're different, younger, kinder, more open." I didn't move. My heart was pounding. He must have heard it. Martin looked at me, his eyes filled with longing, need, despair. His fingers slid to my lips, touched them, and froze. I knew I had to stop him. I knew he was vulnerable, that it was grief, not feelings, that he saw my uncle, not me, but I didn't stop him. Martin leaned down and kissed me, gently, carefully, as if afraid I would push him away. His lips were salty from tears, warm, trembling. I froze, didn't respond, but didn't pull away either. He pulled away himself, looked at me in horror. He whispered, "I'm sorry, God, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's wrong, it's just..." He covered his face with his hands and said he didn't know what came over him. "Forgive me, Daniel, please." I took his wrists and pulled his hands away from his face. I said, "Martin, listen, it's okay. You're hurting, you're looking for comfort, I understand." He shook his head. "No, it's not just comfort. I feel something for you, and it's wrong. Thomas died a month ago, and I'm already... God, what's wrong with me?" His voice trembled. He looked lost, frightened. I didn't know what to say, because, to be honest, I felt something too. Something strange, incomprehensible. Attraction, pity, affection? I couldn't figure it out. I said quietly, "There's nothing wrong with you. You're grieving. You're lonely. You're looking for a connection with the person you lost. And you see him reflected in me. That's normal," Martin replied. "But you're not him. You don't have to carry that burden." I said, "I'm not carrying the burden. I'm just here if you need me. I'm here." Martin looked at me for a long time, then rested his head on my shoulder. I hugged him again. We lay down on the bed fully clothed, on top of the blanket, just hugging each other. We listened to the thunderstorm. He fell asleep first. His breathing evened out and became deep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of his body. What am I doing? This is wrong. He's grieving. He sees me as his uncle. Everything is mixed up in an emotional mess. But at the same time, it feels good to lie there, to feel him close, to feel needed. I fell asleep too. I woke up from the light. The storm was over. The sun was shining through the window. Martin was lying next to me, asleep, his face calm. I looked at him and thought he was beautiful. Tired, exhausted, but beautiful. He opened his eyes, met my gaze, and for a second didn't understand where he was. Then his memory returned. He sat up abruptly and said, I quickly said, nothing happened. We were just sleeping. You fell asleep? I didn't want to wake you up. Martin nodded and wiped his face. He apologized for yesterday, for the kiss, saying it was inappropriate. I said, forget it, even though I knew I couldn't forget. We went down to the kitchen. I made breakfast, and we ate in silence. The atmosphere was awkward and tense. Martin avoided looking at me. After breakfast, he said it was time to go. He got dressed, said a restrained goodbye, and left without looking back. I was left alone. The emptiness was overwhelming. I walked around the rooms, thinking about yesterday, about the kiss, about how we slept in each other's arms, about how I felt. The problem was that I didn't know what I felt. Pity, attraction, a desire to help, something more? Martin didn't show up or call for the next 3 days. I tried to work to sort things out, but my thoughts kept returning to him. I was worried. How was he doing? Was he feeling bad? Was he ashamed? On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore and called him. Martin answered after a long ring, his voice tired and cautious. I asked how he was. Pause. Fine, working, living. I said, Martin, I don't hold a grudge about that evening. You don't have to avoid me. Another pause. He replied that he wasn't avoiding me. He just needed time to think, to figure himself out. I asked, and did you figure it out? He sighed and said, no, I haven't figured it out. Daniel, I'm ashamed. I used you as a substitute. It was mean. I replied, you didn't use me. You were feeling bad. I was there for you. It's okay. Martin said, no, it's not okay. You're Thomas's nephew. You're helping me. And I'm a jerk. I kissed you. It's wrong on every level. I was silent. He said, I need to distance myself. I need time. I'm sorry. He hung up. I stood there with the phone, feeling everything inside me tighten. Empty, lonely. Over the past few days, I had gotten used to Martin, to his presence, his voice, his quiet sadness, and now his absence felt like a loss. I spent another week at the house, finished packing my things, sorted out the paperwork, and decided to leave the house. I called my mother and told her I wasn't going to sell it. She was indignant, saying it was silly. The house would be empty. I said I would come and visit. She sighed and let it go. All this time, not a word from Martin. I want to call, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, afraid of imposing. On the last day before my departure, I packed my things and locked up the house. I went out into the garden to say goodbye to the apple tree. I stood under the branches, looked at the house, and felt heavy-hearted. I didn't want to leave, as if I were leaving something important behind. He heard footsteps. He turned around. Martin was standing at the gate. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, holding a box in his hands. He said quietly, Hi, I heard you're leaving today. I wanted to say goodbye and give you this. He held out the box. I opened it. Photos from an album of him and Thomas together, and a book by Brodsky. I asked why. He replied, I want you to keep them. I have copies of the photos and the book. I think Thomas would want it to stay in the house. It's part of his life here. I closed the box. I said, Martin, talk to me. Don't distance yourself. I'm not demanding anything. I'm not expecting anything. We can just be friends, connected through Thomas, through his memory. Martin lowered his head and confessed, I'm afraid I feel something for you that I shouldn't. I'm afraid I'm betraying Thomas. I'm afraid I'm using you as a replacement, and that's unfair to you. He looked up and said, most of all, I'm afraid that you feel something too, and then we'll both get even more confused. I took a step toward him and said, what if I feel that there's nothing wrong with that? Martin stepped back. Thomas died a month ago. A month. I have no right. I interrupted him. He would want you to be happy. He wrote himself. He said, move on with your life, love again, don't stop. Martin shook his head. But not with you. Not with his nephew. Not with a man who looks so much like him that every time I look at you, I see him. I asked, what if I don't want to be his replacement? What if I want to be myself? And what if you see me and not him? Martin was silent, looking at me with pain and confusion. He whispered, I don't know. I don't know how to separate one from the other. I don't know what I really feel, grief, loneliness, attachment to you. All together? He turned away and said, I need time, a lot of time, to figure things out, to get over the loss, to learn to live without him, and then maybe... He didn't finish. I understood. He wasn't ready. Maybe he would never be ready, and I had no right to pressure him. I said, okay, take as long as you need. I'm not rushing you. I'll just be here if you want to talk. See me, call me okay? Martin nodded without turning around. I walked up behind him and touched his shoulder. He flinched but didn't pull away. I said, you're a good person, Martin. You deserve happiness. Thomas was right. Martin turned around, looked at me, tears in his eyes. He whispered, thank you. We stood there looking at each other. Then he suddenly hugged me tightly, desperately. I hugged him back, standing under the apple tree, hugging each other. I could feel his heart beating, his body trembling. He pulled away first, wiped his eyes, said goodbye, and left without looking back. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner. I left that same day, returned to Moscow, to my apartment, to my life. But something had changed. I could feel it. The next 3 months passed strangely. I worked, met with friends, lived as usual. But my thoughts kept returning to the house, to Thomas, to Martin. I reread my diaries, looked at photographs. I thought about them, and about myself, about my life, about how I was hiding, like my uncle, afraid, like him, wasting my time on fear. A decision was forming inside me. I called my mother and invited her to a restaurant. She arrived surprised. We ordered food and talked about everything. Then I said, Mom, I need to tell you something. She became alarmed. Had something happened? I replied, no, I just want to be honest with my family and with myself. I'm gay, Mom. I always have been. I was just afraid to say it. Silence. She stared at me without blinking. The seconds dragged on forever. She asked, are you serious? I said, yes. She leaned back in her chair and sighed. Oh my God, Daniel, I don't know what to say. I replied, you don't have to say anything, just accept it, please. She was silent for a long time, digesting it, struggling with something inside. Finally, she said, you're my son. I love you no matter what, but I need time to get used to it, to understand, okay? I nodded. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. We finished dinner in silence. She left deep in thought. I was left alone, but I felt an enormous, incredible sense of relief. I had done it. I had told the truth. The next step was the rest. Friends, colleagues. I started talking openly. Some supported me, some distanced themselves, but it became easier. I began to breathe more freely. And all this time I thought about Martina. We wrote to each other sometimes, short messages. How are you? What's new? Nothing personal. But I felt that the connection hadn't weakened. It was just on pause. 3 months later, I made up my mind. I went back to my uncle's town, to the house. Martin didn't know I was coming. I wanted to surprise him. I arrived in the evening, opened the house, and it smelled musty inside. I opened the windows, aired it out, and tidied up. I came for a long time, decided to stay here, work remotely, and wait. I called Martin the next day. His voice sounded surprised. Daniel? I said, hi, I'm in town. I'm here for a while. I'd like to see you if you don't mind. Pause. Then you're here? In the house. I replied, yes, I decided to stay and work from here. The house shouldn't be empty. Another pause. He said quietly, can I come over? I smiled and said, of course, come on over. He arrived an hour later. He got out of the car, stood at the gate, and looked at me. He looked better than 3 months ago. His face was less haggard, his eyes more lively. I went out onto the porch and said hello. He replied, hi, are you really staying here? I nodded. Seriously, I want to try living here for a while, see what it does for me. Martin walked slowly toward the house, climbed the steps, and stopped beside me. We stood close together, looking at each other. He asked why. I answered honestly, because of you, because of my uncle, because of their story, because of myself. I'm trying to understand what I feel, what I want. Martin looked at me for a long time. Then he said quietly, I'm also trying to understand. I've been thinking and analyzing for 3 months, and you know what I've realized? I shook my head. He said, I realize that I miss you, not just Thomas, but you. I miss your voice, the way you look at me, your kindness, and it scares me because I don't know if it's right, if it's too soon, if it's betrayal." His voice trembled. I took a step closer and said, "Thomas wrote that he wants you to be happy. It's not a betrayal if you allow yourself to move on with your life." Martin closed his eyes and exhaled. He opened his eyes and looked at me. He asked, "And you, how you feel?" I took his hand and said, "I don't know for sure, but I want to find out. I want to try. If you want to too, we can go slowly, step by step, without pressure. Just be there for each other and see where it leads." Martin looked at our clasped hands, then at me. He nodded slowly. He whispered, "I want to try." I smiled and squeezed his hand. We entered the house together. The next few weeks passed cautiously, carefully. Martin came every day after work. We had dinner together, talked, watched movies, walked in the garden. We didn't force anything. We just stayed close, getting used to each other again, but in a different way. Sometimes he would freeze, look at me longingly, and I knew he was thinking about Thomas. I wasn't offended. I understood that it was part of the process. Sometimes he would take my hand and just hold it silently, and that was enough for me. A month passed. One evening we were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Martin was holding my hand, his thumb stroking my skin. He said quietly, "When I look at you now, I see you, not him. You understand? I see Daniel. And that's good, that's right." I turned to him. Our eyes met. He leaned over and kissed me, slowly, deliberately, with his eyes open, not out of desperation, not as a substitute, the beginning of something new. I responded to the kiss, and everything inside me warmed up. We pulled apart, sat there, our foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Martin whispered, "I'm ready to try for real, if you are too." I said, "I'm ready too." That night we went upstairs together. Everything was slow, gentle, careful. We learned about each other, opened up, were together not in desperation, but by choice. In the morning, I woke up next to him. He was asleep, his face calm and relaxed. I looked at him and realized I was falling in love. For real. Over the next few months, we built our relationship. Step by step, he told me about Thomas, and I listened without jealousy. It was part of his life, part of who he was. I told him about my fears, about how I came out to my family, about how I was learning to live openly. He supported me and was proud of me. We tidied up the garden together, planted flowers near the apple tree. It was symbolic. We honored Thomas's memory, but we were creating our own story. 6 months later, I asked Martin to move into my house. At first, he hesitated, saying that it was Thomas's house. I replied that now it was our house, if he wanted it to be. He thought about it and agreed. We've been living here together for a year now. We work, we live, we love each other.